Jumbo Espresso Talk Today community. Akwaba to the Espresso Talk Today show. Welcome to the Espresso Talk Today show. I'm Amma Robin, host of this great and groundbreaking Black Empowerment podcast show. If you're just joining us for the first time, then I wish you an especially happy and hearty Akwaba, or welcome, to the show and to the Espresso Talk Today community. Our community of amiable intellectuals welcomes everyone. We discuss everything from the happy and uplifting to the uncommon and the uncomfortable. Nothing is off the table here. Today's show is about a very uncommon topic: racism denial. You might be thinking, how can anyone deny the existence of racism? Don't most people, not everyone, but most people believe that racism exists? Well, yes and no. Today's guest will explain that answer, and I'm not being cheeky or difficult, but it's complicated. Here's another answer. We all deny racism in some way or at some time. I didn't believe that until, guess what? I actually caught myself denying racism. That was an aha moment for me. And after you hear today's guest on the show, you might have an aha moment too. Have you ever said, racism isn't as bad as it used to be? Or, I don't see race. Or perhaps you've said, that's just how they were raised. They can't help it. If you answered yes to any of these, I did, then you might be a racism denier. But stick around, we're going to discuss it. We are honored today to have Professor Phillippe Copeland join our show. Let me take a moment to introduce you properly to Dr. Copeland. Phillippe Copeland is a clinical assistant professor at the Boston University School of Social Work. His scholarship, teaching, and service focus on the intersection of social justice, democracy, and social welfare, with an emphasis on racial capitalism and abolition. This includes such areas as the Black Lives Matter movement, decarceration, health justice, and anti-racism education. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Dr. Copeland's work with the Boston University Center for Antiracist Research. We're going to discuss more of it on the show, but let me just tell you that the mission of the Boston University Center for Antiracist Research is to convene researchers and practitioners from various disciplines to figure out novel and practical ways to understand, explain, and solve the seemingly intractable problems of racial inequity and injustice. The center is working towards building an anti-racist society that ensures equity and justice for all. More power to them. They completely have my support, and I hope they'll have yours too. We have a lot to talk about today. But first, a big asante sana to Dr. Phillippe Copeland for contributing his time and expertise in discussing the topic of racism denial. As you know, this is a Black Empowerment podcast show. Black empowerment is love and history and culture, community, political and economic power, spirituality, health, activism, and a whole lot more. It originated on the continent of Africa, and it's right where we are right now. Black empowerment is growing, evolving, expanding, and gaining more and more strength, and it's helping us to fight racism in all its forms and wherever we find it, even within ourselves. This is Black empowerment at its finest. Let's get to it. I'll see you after the show. Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, it's going good, thanks. As you can see, I am having an espresso with the guest on our show, Dr. Phillippe
I do.
Copeland. Yes,
Hi, good to meet you, Dr. Phillippe.
Dr.
Nice to
Copeland.
meet you all as well.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's good to have you here.
yes, and we are really excited that you're here today because wow, we're going to discuss. We discuss a lot of racism on this show, and just when you think you've covered everything, then something new comes up, and I think we have to talk about that. So, Aquaba to the show, and Asante for joining us today. And well, Uh, we always do tell our guests, our audience, that we're going to have an uncommon conversation. And I think this one will be one of our most uncommon. Honestly, I probably say that every single time, and every time it really is true. Um, but when I thought about, racism denial, I think, oh, when I hear the term, I think, oh yeah, I know exactly what that is. And then I think when I'm trying to define it, I really can't. So I looked up
Mm.
a definition, and it is obscuring the reality of racism or minimizing its significance. And after reading that, I felt that maybe I don't know what racism denial is. So, Dr. Copeland, if you'll explain, what it is and give us some detail about that, please.
Sure. So, racism denial is a couple of things. It involves both political strategy. It's also a psychological defense mechanism or a coping mechanism. So, in terms of the political strategy, there are people who know that racism is a problem, but they don't want to solve the problem, and they don't want anybody else to solve the problem. And so one of the things that they do is that they try to convince people that either there is no problem to be solved or that the problem isn't big enough to warrant significant attention, right? It doesn't require intervention. It doesn't require systemic approaches. It doesn't require, radical changes in policy, um, because they don't want the problem to be solved.
Yeah.
So those are the people who are engaging in racism denial in a strategic way. They have a political objective, which is to keep racism in place. Then there are the people for whom racism denial is more psychological, and they're dealing with the contradictions of living in societies, particularly so-called liberal democracies, that claim to have a certain set of values, but that people can see through their own experience that these societies do exactly the opposite of what they claim to believe. And so, in order to function in a society like that, without a lot of just ongoing psychological distress, one of the things that you do is that you engage in racism denial to relieve your distress. And so, those folks don't necessarily know that they're engaging in racism denial when it happens, but they know enough to know that it does relieve some of their distress, some of their upset, some of their frustration, some of their fear, um, some of their confusion. And so it becomes a habit, right? When people try to confront them with the reality of racism, they rely on this coping mechanism, which is to try to deny it, to minimize it, etc. And those are kind of the two sort of forms, the big kind of versions of it. And of course, for some people, it's a little bit of both, right? So let's say that you're engaging in racism denial as a strategy. If you are consciously distorting reality or lying about the past or the present, there's no way that you can do that without doing damage to your own psyche. And so I think for people who are doing it for political gain, I really do think that there's a point at which it becomes psychological for them as well, because it's the only way that they can continue to do it, right? And sort of maintain the facade and maintain the dishonesty. Um, and so you have those kind of two forms, but I think that there's a point where they start to feed on each other in a kind of vicious cycle. And they reinforce each other. And I think that there are people who they really do lose the ability to assess reality accurately.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly,
So,
mental health professionals will tell you that that is not an indicator of good mental health, period. Right. And so, those are the two ways that I talk about racism denial. And then it has a number of forms. And so, let me pause there in case you had any questions about what I said so far.
I actually did, kind of going right back to the first part of when you were answering the question. You mentioned that it's a sort of defense
Mm-hmm.
uh, against reality or against something that they're afraid of. What is it exactly that they're defending themselves against? And how can they recognize themselves as, because although they may be acting in a defensive way, they're actually being kind of offensive and attacking
Mm-hmm.
people in that
Mm-hmm.
reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what do you think they're defending themselves against? And how can somebody know, like someone listening who might not necessarily consider themselves a racism denier, how could they know whether or not they're doing that?
That's a really good question. And I think one way of thinking about it is for people to just get sort of attuned to what's happening in their own body
Hmm.
in these moments, right? So there's what you're saying with your mouth, and then there's what's happening in yourself, right? There's really what are the feelings behind it? And what are the feelings after you've done it? Do
Yeah,
you feel relieved, right? Do you feel better?
yeah,
Do you feel superior to the person who you believe is, race baiting or playing the race card, making things about race? So I think that the emotional element is one kind of a tell, right? So
yeah,
if you're feeling angry, what are you feeling angry about, right? So if somebody's just providing factual information, why is that upsetting you, right? So that's one way to think about it. It's like, well, what is going on in this moment? And that it's not just an intellectual thing of people like, debating ideas, right? Or debating controversy, but it's like, what is happening inside me that I'm having this reaction? And again, after I engage in the behavior, how do I feel then? And I do think that one key is that if you feel a sense of relief or that you feel better about something that, if you think about it, nobody should feel better about racism, right?
yeah,
So if you're feeling better about it, something is wrong, right? There's something wrong going on because you shouldn't feel better about racism,
yeah.
right? So I don't know if that answered your question.
It actually does. Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a question about it as a strategic,
Mm-hmm.
tool. Um, so I mean, are there actually policies that are policies and laws made up as a form of a racial denial, racism denial? I mean, that kind of.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we actually have a very dramatic example of this recently. You may have heard about the banning of advanced placement African American studies in Florida.
Mm.
I think that this is a really powerful example
Could you
of
explain that
racism
to me?
denial through policy, right?
Yes.
So the governor of a state in the United States has said to the College Board, which are folks who develop curricular standards for folks to get, college credit, you're like literally just created, this has never happened before, just created curriculum for high school students to get a taste of African American studies before they go to college. You cannot teach that in our state the way that you have it. And if you don't change it, we will not allow our students to get access to that learning. Yeah, yeah. And this just happened. And one of the things that happened very quickly is that conservatives in other states have started saying, we need to do this as well
Yeah.
because, the College Board is national, right? So
Mhm.
whatever Florida is doing, we think that that's a great idea. We can
Yeah.
challenge this in our states as well,
Mm.
because this is part of a so-called, critical race theory, et cetera, and wokeness
Yeah.
and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So absolutely, absolutely. I think right now, a lot of what's happening in terms of, sort of education policy in the United States, and I'm actually starting to hear a little bit of this happening in the UK as well, right? There's very similar rhetoric. There's very similar sort of efforts to say, okay, we're going to take a hard look at what you're teaching children. And if it's these kinds of, allegedly racist or anti-white, unpatriotic kinds of information, we're going to say, you can't teach that to kids. We're not going to allow you to teach that to kids, right? So it's not even just in the States. And in my work, I talk about this as really mandating miseducation.
Mhm.
That's what they're doing under the guise of, fairness or parental rights. They are consciously miseducating children and now, in some cases, college students
Yeah.
as an effort to make sure that this problem does not get solved. Because you can't solve a problem that you don't understand, right?
Mhm.
Absolutely. But I was a little concerned about how the College Board responded, though, by making some changes.
Yes, yes, yes. And, you know, unfortunately, it sounds like there was an effort to appease these folks, which never works. You
Right.
know, you never, you cannot appease racial backlash by definition.
Yeah.
So what they've done is they've just created more of it because
Mhm.
now racism denial is going to increase.
Hmm.
And this particular strategy is going to become a model. It's going to become
Yeah.
the standard, and people are going to do it everywhere. Just like they did with the so-called critical race theory bans,
Yeah.
just like they were doing with the book bans. You know, one person does it, and then it becomes a template, and now everybody's doing it everywhere.
Yeah.
And so there's been an escalation in the backlash, and unfortunately, in this particular skirmish, um, the College Board lost. You know, accurate education, good anti-racist education just lost an important battle. And we'll see what happens now. But yeah, it's really unfortunate that that happened.
Yeah.
And I'm curious that I actually 100% agree. This is terrible, but and there are those other voices saying, I'm curious what you would say to them who say, those who say, quote unquote, we're protecting our children from some form of indoctrination. Because that's the
Mhm.
sort of rhetoric I've seen about these issues. But I'm curious
Absolutely. Hmm.
how you can respond to that.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this both as a public scholar and as a parent of children who are in K to 12. I care a lot about this. And I actually think that we should be having a debate about the content and quality of the education that kids are receiving in terms of a very, very important topic, um, where the stakes are really high. These are life and death matters, as we keep seeing, day after day in the news. These are not academic issues. Kids are dealing with these things right now in their lives. Their parents are being affected in their lives. We need to ensure that we're preparing them to be part of the solution so that you don't reach adulthood and be sort of functionally illiterate when it comes to this issue, which is the situation with many adults. I work with adults and I interact with adults all the time in my classes who will say, I never learned this, I never heard this. And I have never heard them say, I'm so grateful that people didn't teach me this,
Yeah.
ever. I've
Yeah.
never heard an adult white student say, I feel like I was protected, defended.
Yeah.
They feel betrayed, they feel angry, um, they feel grief, and they feel completely unprepared
Mm.
to live as equals in a free society,
Yeah.
which is really what this is about. It's not just about, facts and figures and people and places. It really is about how are you prepared to function as an equal in this world?
Mm.
And we have generations of white folk who have reached adulthood who do not know how to do that at all.
Yeah.
And so they're doing a lot of harm, including people who are decent, good people who
Yeah.
don't want to hurt anybody,
Mm.
but because they're unprepared to deal with this problem, they contribute to it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be that way. And that's the good news is that we can do something about this, which is to ensure that all of our kids are getting really, really good preparation. And again, I think it's fair to say that there are situations where that's not the case, and parents should be asking hard questions. I have those questions about my own kids' education. So the
Mhm.
debate isn't wrong. The questions are not wrong. It's the bad faith that's wrong. It's the fact that none of this is really about what's good for children. None
Yeah.
of this is really about education at all. It's a smokescreen for people to try to prevent us from actually solving a problem that affects everybody, and that everybody has a stake in solving. So that's what I would say to those people. As a parent, I hear you, and don't be played.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these people talking about kids, they don't really care about your kids. They're
No.
not trying to help your kids. They're trying to help themselves. And they're trying to maintain systems that are doing a lot of harm to a lot of people, including a lot of white people, by the way.
Yeah.
Only for the
Yeah.
sole reason that it benefits
And
them.
I do also have another question based off that. you were
Mhm.
mentioning we're not asking the right questions, and that you said that you ask your kids, the tough questions, which I mean, I also received that growing up from my parents and a lot of my family members, which may
Mhm.
have helped or messed me up. We'll find out along the way. But what is one of the questions that you would ask, for example?
Wow,
Like
that's a
what?
really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, honestly, I would start with asking people, what is racism,
Hmm.
right? Because there's
Yeah.
actually a lot of misunderstanding about what racism is.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's very difficult to solve a problem that you don't understand,
Yeah.
right? So, what is racism? How does it actually function? What are the effects that it has on people and the planet? And most importantly, what are things that you can do about it? Because there are, in fact, things that you can do about it. This is not a problem that we have to live with.
Yeah.
We can solve this problem. Yeah. So,
Okay.
was
So
there a follow up?
yeah. So there was one issue you mentioned about parents not asking their kids the big or the right questions.
Mhm.
Now, what is one of those examples that you would ask one of your children? Or what do you think those right questions might be?
Yeah. So I think I said a little bit about this, but I guess I would be curious what they think should be done about racism.
Hmm.
What are their solutions?
Yeah.
What do they think needs to be done? Because I do think it's helpful to get people thinking about what we can do, and not just focusing on what's wrong.
Yeah.
One of the things I spend a lot of time doing is really trying to learn from people that are doing the work about what they're doing, and what they're learning. So I always ask people, what are you doing and what are you learning? And I've learned a lot from folks who are out there in all different places in their lives, people on the front lines, who have been doing this work. And there's some really amazing things that people are doing to move the work forward.
Yeah.
And those stories are really important to gather, to share with each other. Particularly in times like these, I think that it's been a really rough week, certainly in the States. We talk about Tyree Nichols and other kinds of things. And I know that for me, being reminded that there are people who care, that there are people who want things to change, there are people who are, in fact, making a difference. I think asking about those kinds of things is really important, including where they're doing it themselves, right? Because sometimes we write ourselves out of the story, and we see ourselves as sort of passive recipients of the problem. And often we are doing things that actually are making a difference. We just don't necessarily think about it, or we're
Hmm.
not being asked what we're doing, you know? So I'd want to know about that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would like to get back to the different kinds of different forms that racism denial can take, because
Mm-hmm.
like I said, I was really surprised by a lot of this. Then oh yeah, I recognize that. So can you talk about that some of the different forms it takes?
Yeah, so I've identified sort of 8 forms that it can take, and I'll just briefly describe them. So the first form is refuting. And so refuting usually involves just straight out saying that either racism itself is not a problem, or that racism was not a factor in a particular situation. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about the fact that or there's a kind of belief that people have that because the officers, who beat Tyree Nichols to death happen to be Black,
Hmm.
that clearly this is not a racism issue,
Yeah.
right? And many people are generally like, I don't get it. Like, how can that have anything to do with racism?
Yeah, I've heard that.
And so that's an example of refuting, right? So that's happening right now. Um, Often, if refuting doesn't work, people go to minimizing, right? And so it's like, okay, yes, there's racism happening, but it's not as bad as you're saying, right? It's not as big of a problem as you're making it out to be. You're exaggerating. You're reading into something. You're overreacting, right? Um, or they'll say things like, okay, racism isn't as bad as it used to be. That's another kind of minimizing, right? Very, very common. And so they'll shift the focus to talking about racial progress and things like this. Um,
Hmm.
then sometimes people will engage in what I refer to as myopia. So myopia, it's very much related to the notion of color blindness, right? And so myopia is a situation where people are either unable or unwilling to perceive racism accurately, right? So people will say, I don't see race. What they really mean is, I don't see racism,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's what it means in practice. And so racism is happening and they just aren't seeing it for what it is. And so then that's how they respond, right? It's like, well, how could that, like, how is that about race? Or what do you mean that's about race? Why do you make everything about race? you know?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And racism could just be right up in their face, and they're like, I don't see any racism here. There's no racism happening here. So that's the folks who engage in myopia. Um, Sometimes people engage in what I call replacing, and so it's an effort to change the subject. So these people will acknowledge that racism exists. They just don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about everything else. So you try to engage them about race or racism, and they're like, well, what about gender? You know, or what about homophobia? Right? So they'll get you to try to talk about some other problem, all of which are real problems. But again,
Yeah.
even then, their goal isn't really to talk about that problem, is to get you to stop talking about race, right? That's what they're really trying to do. Or they'll try to shift the focus from, let's say, uh, the ways in which white people engage in racism to talking about, people of color,
Yeah.
right? So you'll try to talk about, racist policing, and people will say, yeah, but what about black on black crime, right?
Yes.
Classic replacing, right? And again, the goal isn't to have a real conversation about, the violence that occurs in, impoverished, segregated communities, right? It's to change the subject, right? Very common replacing. That's hugely popular. What about black on black crime? It's hugely popular.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so that's a big replacer. Um, the other thing that people will do is that they engage in defending. Often it's often when they feel like they're being accused of racism, but they also can do it when they feel like their group is being accused of racism. And so they'll say things like, well, that can't be racist because, or here's a good one. I can't be racist because some of my best friends are black. I mean, this is like from like
Yeah.
the
Say it.
this is from like the
Every
the
time.
greatest hits album of defending against the charge of race. Some of my best friends are black, right? Or you
I mean,
deploy the black. I call it deploying the black friend.
yeah. That's cold. No, it's
You know what I mean? But again,
original.
the point is to defend yourself. It's to use, let's say, your black friend as kind of like a human shield
Yeah.
against critique, right? Or the accusation of racism. Sometimes if defending doesn't work, they'll say, okay, yes, fine, that was racist, but then they start making excuses for it, right? So a common example is, well, I was just kidding. I was just telling a joke, right?
Yeah.
Humor's a big one.
Oh,
Yes.
You're overreacting. I was just being funny. I wasn't, or they'll say something like, well, so and so, they're from a certain generation and they can't help it. That's just how they were raised, right? Another common excuse. So there's excusing. Then sometimes people will apply these concepts to discussions of the past, right? This happens a lot. And so they engage in what I refer to as revising history.
Yeah.
And so what they really do is misrepresent history in order to avoid accountability for racism that occurred in the past, or to avoid accountability for their embracing of people who've engaged in racism in the past. Really classic example of this is so-called, lost cause stories about the Confederacy, right? So there's a whole body of work about the lost cause and this effort to claim that, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, it was about states' rights, right?
Yeah.
And to turn the Confederates into heroes, right? Defending the honor of their states against Northern aggression. Like there's still people who go around and say this. There are people who teach this in schools. Classic example of revising history, right? Again, it's a form of racism denial. Um, and then finally, there's what I refer to as distorting. And distorting, I think, is probably the most troubling form of racism denial, because what people do is that they turn reality inside out
Yeah.
and try to claim that the real problem is the mistreatment of white people. That's the real problem,
wow.
and not racism as it's actually experienced by people of color. And so this happens a lot
Yeah.
these days, where people will claim, make various claims that such and such is racist against white people. So, for example, the Supreme Court is going to be debating affirmative action. I mean, for decades now, people have claimed that that's discrimination against white people, right? Which is a complete misrepresentation, And yet there are people on the court right now that they subscribe to um, that form of racism denial. In fact, when they were having oral arguments about it, the racism denial was thick. I mean, you just heard it all over the court, this kind of distortion, right? And this notion that policies that are meant to actually promote equality for everybody are somehow discriminatory towards white people.
Yeah.
Very, very common. And so those are the 8 kinds, sort of forms that it can take. And then sometimes, depending on the person, they'll go from one form to the next. Right. So if one form isn't working, they'll switch to another one. Or if you interact with certain people over time, you see that they have kind of their favorite ones that they use all the time. And so, like, it's like, okay, I've talked to you before, and you're going to do a lot of defending and excusing because that's what you always do. That's what you always do. And I'm ready for you because I know that's where you're going to go, you know? So I don't know if that answered your question.
It did. And, I'm just sorry to say that I have heard every single one of these, and not just once, but multiple times. I'm just
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was gonna tell Ben I was gonna ask him this, and I really don't have the answer to this. As a student, what have you heard most? Which one is most common, in your experience?
I think as well, I've heard all of them actually, but I think the most common one I've heard as a student, well, I went to an international school for pretty much my whole life until I came to university. And I was always maybe one of 3, 5 maximum Black people in the entire school, pretty much the whole time. And that wasn't really discussed very often. And we always had these signs up with like big flowery rainbowy things saying diversity, inclusion, acceptance. And then you go around and people are just calling you like N-word and pretty vile things and doing some very vile things. And I was always curious, so where's where are the people of color? And we had this big assembly one time, and the head of the head of the high school said, "Look, I don't see color. None of us see color." And I was thinking, okay, that's ridiculous, but I mean, I'm not that surprised because he's a damn fool anyway. Then we had this university. Then we had this university thing not that long ago, and people were asking this the rector of the university, that's the president now, like, where are the people of color here? Because there's also this ideology of inclusion and acceptance, and he said this kind of empty answer like, oh, we're going to make plans for it in the future. And I thought that was kind of disappointing, but it also really reflects what you just said. There's some deflecting there. So once you do look around the room and you ask, where are they? And you say, I don't see color. You only see one color in the room, to be honest. But I think those are definitely the most common ones. And the I have a Black friend.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely, whenever someone does anything outlandish, they either say it was just a joke. Whenever they do or say anything outlandish, they say either A, it was a joke, or B, I have Black friends, or C, I know a Black person who thought this was cool. And then
Yeah, that's another one. Right. So something, it's like if you know a Black person who supports something, it can't be racist, right? That's another really common defending technique, is to cite a Black person who said something similar,
exactly,
or who agrees with that and says, well, it can't be racist because so-and-so didn't think it was racist.
exactly. Yeah.
Very, very common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think for me, and I was thinking, I think refuting is the one that I hear the most, and that they say, I mean, people admit that, well, racism is a problem, but it's not so much of a problem anymore. And yeah, of course, yeah, things are better now, and well, people are always saying that I'm overreacting, and I'm always going to the race card, and yeah, I said, well, it's not my card, it's my experience that well, for instance, a friend was saying that, well, she'd read about 20 million slaves brought over from Senegal to, out throughout the world. And I said, well, they weren't actually slaves. They were people, and they
Hmm.
were slaves. And then I got oh, Robin, you're always bringing up that stuff,
Yeah.
and you're always over
Hmm.
God, you're so serious about everything. And I'm thinking, well, wouldn't people say that, this is, kidnapping, and a kid goes out to get an apple or something, and he gets kidnapped and tortured and carried across the ocean, is 20 million people, isn't that a big deal? But no, they always say, no, I'm always overreacting. So,
Yeah.
Hmm.
so that's mine. But I imagine that both Black people and white people do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody does this. Everybody does this, and it's very, very common. And one of the things, and so I'll give you an example, and you may have seen this, right? So, in my experience, when some people try to talk about colorism,
Mm.
right, or pigmentocracy, as some people talk about it in other settings, right? Amongst people of color, the racism denial comes out really hard.
Yeah.
And a lot of them do not want to have this conversation. And they say very similar things. It's like, well, that can't be colorism because XYZ, or, okay, yes, my aunt says these really terrible things about dark skin, but that's just how she was raised. That's that generation, that's just how they think. Or, well, that was just a joke, or you're taking this too seriously, or, okay, yeah, there's some colorism, but it's not that bad. Um, you know, and, I think that that's an example of where, again, it really is a form of racism denial. In this case, denying a particular form that racism takes that actually is really significant and has a huge impact in people's lives. But there are people who benefit from colorism, so they don't want that to change. So strategically, they don't want to have that conversation. And then there are people for whom that conversation is just too painful, right? It's too painful. And so they try to avoid it, and they try to keep other people from talking about it. They try to silence it. And so I think that that's a good example of how, anybody can engage in racism denial, because racism, it affects different people in different ways.
Yeah.
The problem is big. Um, it's big. And so, yeah, anybody, it's not just white people, anybody can engage in racism denial. I've done it myself, you know, and I've had to learn to think differently, to react differently, to engage in a different way, you know. So yeah, and in my experience, lots of people do this kind of stuff.
And how do you, well, do you, first question, I guess, then is, do you respond differently to people of color who engage in racism denial? And then the second question is, how should we respond to Black people or people of color who are racism deniers?
That's a great question. I think it really depends upon who I'm dealing with, right? So, for example, when I encounter, let's say, Black or Brown folk or Indigenous folk who are engaging in racism denial in a strategic way,
Yeah.
one, I don't expect to persuade them,
Hmm.
um, because, they have a vested interest in racism denial, right?
Yeah.
So I tend to, the goal there is really to challenge it and to expose that that's what they're doing, to name it, to call them on it, and to take away the legitimacy that comes from not calling it what it is. So I'll give you an example. There are a lot of Black conservatives, for example, who engage in racist denial all the time. Um, and so again, I don't necessarily expect them to stop doing that anytime soon.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to challenge them and to call them on it and to say, this is what you're doing and this is why it's wrong. And this is why it makes it harder for us to solve this problem. Whereas people who it's a bit more psychological, I think the goal is really more about healing, right? It's about healing. It's about helping people to free their minds, to understand why they're having the reaction that they're having,
Yeah.
and to give them opportunities to get free, and you don't have to do this anymore, you know? And rather than trying to avoid the pain of the contradictions of the society that you're trying to live in, let's make it better. Let's
Yeah.
change it, you know? So yeah, I think it depends on who I'm dealing with.
Well,
Okay.
this could be a good time to bring up Candace Owens. I mean,
Oh,
I,
yeah,
Yes,
I
that.
bring
It
some
was
of the
just on my mind.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
yes. So how would you respond to her? Some of the things that she has said.
Yeah, I mean, I would put her in the category of people who do it strategically. And I think that the goal would be to just sort of expose what she's doing and to challenge it, particularly if there's an opportunity to do it in a public forum. Because one of the things that I do think needs to happen is that people who engage in strategic racism denial are often allowed to get away with it. They're often treated as if what they're saying is respectable and worthy of debate. They're often provided with a platform. And so what I want to do is say, okay, what you're doing is not legitimate. It's not respectable. It's not simply a difference of opinion. You are engaged in efforts to mislead, to miseducate, and to deceive people. That's what you're doing, and that's
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm going to focus on, because I'm not necessarily going to convince you to stop, but I want people to know what you're doing and why it's a problem, and that people shouldn't allow you to get away with it. And so that's what I mean, if and when I ever engage with Candace Owens, I mean, that's what I would be trying to do. Because she really, she is a repeat offender.
Yeah, absolutely.
She really provides a master class in this. And because she's Black, it comes with a certain degree of legitimacy, which a white person doesn't have. And so it really amplifies the power, right, of the denial when people like, Candace Owens or John McWhorter is another person who does this a lot. I mean, I think that because he sort of presents himself as an intellectual, he tends to be taken a little bit more seriously than a Candace Owens, right? He has a Ph.D., he's a scholar. And so that's kind of his armor, right? That's his shield that he brings to the debate, to the struggle. But really, he's just saying the same things that Candace Owens says. It just has the veneer of intellectualism behind it. But it's really the same kind of stuff. So yeah, that would be my strategy with people like that. Because I do think that there are folks who listen to them.
Yeah.
And some people might say, you know what? I don't really think this person is credible, and I'm not going to listen to them anymore.
Yeah.
And that would be totally worth it, including a lot of Black people who they listen to them, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think with Candace Owens or someone like that, there's so I've been watching the Boondocks. The tangent does make sense, but I've been watching the Boondocks, and there's this one character,
Yeah.
Uncle Ruckus, and he's
Yes.
for those who haven't seen the show, he's pretty much Uncle Tom. He hates his Blackness, but incredibly vehemently. Like, he really doesn't only hate his Blackness, he claims he isn't Black, even though he's a very dark skinned, and he disses everyone. He's the most racist character I've ever seen, but he is Black. And even though he says all these awful, outlandish things, he still kind of comes back to the community, and the community still kind of takes care of him. Like, there's this one scene where they said, look, Ruckus is an idiot, but like, he's still our people. So at what point do you say, look, or draw a line rather between, look, they're still our people, and okay, who they are is actually damaging or contributing to the damages our community is facing?
Yeah, I would say that I don't subscribe to, I think, the notion of kind of banishment from
Yeah,
Blackness or something. You know what I'm
yeah.
saying?
No, I feel that. Yeah.
Because, uh, Black people are different.
Yeah.
And we've never all agreed on these issues, right?
Yeah.
We've never all agreed on these issues. And, the fact of the matter is that sometimes we get it wrong,
Yeah.
you know? So, for example, I think that there are Black conservatives who sincerely believe that conservatism is better for Black people. They generally believe that.
Mhm.
Now, the way that they go about sort of promoting those ideas, defending those ideas, I often find to be intellectually dishonest. But their motivation is not to do harm. Like, they
Yeah.
believe that Black people would be better off if they embraced a conservative way of thinking and living.
Yeah.
Um, I strongly disagree with them, and I think that the evidence doesn't support that. if and when they're interested in engaging in good faith debate about those things, I'm happy to do that. What I won't do is engage in bad faith. And when that's happening, I want to expose that that's what happened. That's what's happening. And that's what I think that frustrates me about people like Candace, is that I feel like Candace, a lot of what she does and says is really in bad faith. Yeah. And I think that people need to know that, because it's wrong. It's wrong.
Yeah.
And that some of the ways that she tries to defend or advance conservative politics are deeply problematic and dishonest. And I think that she should be called on that, just like I should be called on it. If I was doing that, people should call me on it, right? Because it's important. Because these debates are important. They're life and death debates. And so, let's engage that process in an honorable way. And if you're not willing to do that, then you deserve critique. You deserve condemnation.
Yeah.
But you're still Black.
Yeah.
But you're no less Black than you were before.
No, agreed. Yeah, 100%.
And so that's how I kind of think about that. And I really do think a lot of this stuff, you really can have a somewhat objective debate about it. So, for example, if you really believe that conservative policies would be better for Black people, prove it. Show me the data, show me the evidence, show me your reasoning. I feel very, very confident, having spent a lot of time on these questions, that the evidence does not support the idea that conservative policies are better for Black people as a group. They just don't. And I'm willing to have that debate anywhere, anytime, because I just don't think that that's true. And that's not ideology. That's data. That's evidence. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, it's kind of like the thing about schools. I think that they're things that need to be debated, but they need to be debated in good faith.
Yeah.
And the problem is that a lot of what's going on, the goal is not to engage in meaningful discourse in any way. It's to obscure, it's to deny, it's to deceive, it's to mislead, it's to bully, it's to intimidate. It's to silence. And whenever that's happening, people who are doing that need to be challenged, because it's bad for democracy and it's bad for freedom and it's bad for everybody.
Very true. Yeah. But if we turn to some of the statements from white folk, get a lot of those. Yeah. And it, I don't think are strategic. Some are just, well, let's say innocent. For instance, I was watching a show and they were talking about how, oh man, I just love Chinese girls. I love Chinese girls. And the other person responded, that's kind of racist to say. And the person said, well, it's not racist if I'm saying I like them. Wait a minute. It still is.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good example. I think compliments are another way of excusing racism, right? So, or like let's say you have a positive stereotype about a group, right? People will say, well, how can that be racist? I'm saying good things about you. How can that be racist, right? I'm saying good things about Asians or good things about Blacks or good things about, natives. Like, how can that be racist, right? So, yeah, I think for me, if you're asking me how I would respond in the moment,
oh, how would you categorize it first, and then how would you?
Oh, well, that's a good. Well, yeah, I think that what you're describing is a good example of either defending or excusing, right? That can't be racist because, or okay, maybe that was a little bit racist, but still, I just I just like those women, I can't help it, It's like what was that song? Why do I do like that? Why do I chase the cat? You know what I mean? Like, kind of like, I just, I'm just one of those people. I can't help it, And I think that both, you could think about that as defending or excusing.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the response to that?
Yeah, I think a helpful thing to do whenever somebody says something is not racist is just to ask them, well, what do you think racism is?
Oh.
And let's just start there. Because maybe we just have different notions of what that is.
Yeah.
And often what will happen is that I discover fairly quickly that the person's understanding of racism is either limited in some way or is inaccurate. And I can do something about that. I can correct that, And for some people, that in itself, it sounds really simple, but that in itself starts a process of change for them because they're like, I just wasn't thinking of it that way. I hadn't thought of it that way. Now I'm at least thinking that, like, okay, I can see how that could be seen as racist. Even if they're like, kind of like, okay, I'm not quite ready for me to say that that's racist, but I can see why you think it's racist.
Okay.
Right. Or I could see how somebody from that background might feel like, that's racist.
Yeah.
But I really do think sometimes that's the most helpful question to ask people. It's just like, can you explain what you're talking about? Let's just start there. Like, what do you think racism is? you know, and see what they say. I mean, I've actually seen people, like when you ask them questions, they talk themselves into a different point of view
Yeah.
because what they see is that what they're saying doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Like the more they talk, the less sense it makes. And then even they're like, yeah, like, what am I talking about?
Yeah.
Or
See,
like, you know what? I don't even believe that. What am I saying? It's like, exactly. What are you saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you're just going around saying these things and you're on autopilot. You're not thinking about it. And now because you had to think about it a little bit, maybe, just maybe there's the chance to think differently, right? Or not. And, I always say to my students, it's an open invitation, which means you can decline. So
Yeah.
you can say, you know what, I'm not interested in learning or changing or growing right now. And I'll say, okay, I mean, good luck.
Yeah.
no, I mean, I wish you felt differently, but all right then, be well. And I don't need to fight with you, argue with you. I don't need to carry around a lot of upset about you. I can just be like, all right,
Mhm.
I'm moving on, you know, peace
Yeah.
out.
Peace
Yeah.
out.
I was talking to Howard Stevenson, and he was explaining about when about racial encounters and all of that, and he said one thing you can do to empower yourself is to always have a comeback line. And
Mm-hmm.
he said, make it general, make it short. And I'm still working on my comeback line. That's not, too aggressive or, doesn't involve vulgarities. But, you know, I was
That's
thinking,
just you. That's just you. Yeah.
this is really good though. Well, what do you think racism is? Instead of just saying, what are you, stupid? That kind of thing. You can't really believe that. I mean, that's what I really want to say, or something more. But wouldn't be helpful. It wouldn't keep the dialogue open. But I think a comeback line is having that does seem like it would be more empowering to you. And I think that, you're saying that you really do have to confront these issues, and that does empower the person, who heard it. And I don't know how to expect the person who made the statement, but it's empowering for the person, for one person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, often we do this work because it's good for us and not necessarily because it's going to change the person. Because ultimately, you know, um, that person has their own work to do. And so if I'm trying to do their work for them, it's not a surprise that I'm exhausted, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's not your job to change them. You can walk with them,
Yeah.
right? You can walk with them, you can work with them, but like at the end of the day, they have to do their own work. And I've had situations where I said to somebody, I said, you know what, I'm going to stop now because um, really you need to do some things, and then come back and maybe we'll try this again,
Yeah.
right? Because I'm doing all the work here, and that's not, I'm not feeling that. I'm saying. I remember I said to somebody and I know that they didn't take it very well, and I just said, listen, just comment less and read more. Just read more, please. Just go read more, and then come back. You know, I'm not saying I don't want to talk to you anymore, but honestly, like, I mean, you're so misinformed that like we can't even really have a conversation. We really can't. So just take a beat, you know, go do a little homework and let me know how it goes, right? Because I'm just like, man, we really can't get anywhere here because you're so miseducated and so misinformed. And I'm like, you got to work on that first, you
Yeah.
know? Got to work on that first.
I love that. Comment less, read more. I mean, that's actually good advice anyway. Yeah.
That's good
In
advice.
my experience, what my experience of the U.S. is that people really they seem to value opinion more than learning.
Yeah.
I mean, the people just go out there and they will say the most uninformed stuff with great confidence, with no embarrassment, with
Yeah.
pride.
Right.
That's
And I'm like, wow. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I'm like, listen, like if an opinion is worth having, it's worth having an informed one. you know? I mean, take the time, learn a little bit. I mean, I've gotten to a place where I'm actually really comfortable now saying, you know what, I don't know enough to comment on that yet. I don't know enough.
Yeah.
So I don't have a comment because I need to learn more, you know, versus
No.
folks that are just, they have an opinion about everything and really don't know much of anything, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds very American. Sounds very un-American to say, you know what, I got to think about this.
Yeah, it doesn't sound right. So in a heated debate, you know what, that's a really valuable point. You were heard, and I'm gonna no, that's not.
No, it's like, no, I'll get back to you. I need to read up about that.
Yeah.
Peace out. What?
Yeah.
Back here.
I'm sorry, Ben, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was. Um, yeah, so we mentioned that, there are certain responses you can have to, racism that you might hear. And are there certain things that you have that you just kind of directly respond to outside of what you think racism is? Are there certain things you have that's kind of at your disposal that go with that? Or is that kind of the
Yeah,
go-to?
yeah. So I often will ask people questions. So for example, I'll ask somebody, well, can you tell me, where did you hear that? Or do you have some data to support that? Or what was your source for that? Right? And again, it slows things down a little bit. It makes people have to do a little bit of work. Usually, if somebody responds, I express gratitude, even if I don't think the response was great. Like somebody will go and they'll find some right-wing website or whatever, and they'll come up with some questionable data. But I'll say to them, "Thanks for taking the time to find some data. Thank you.
Yeah.
And this is what's wrong with it. Like now we can talk about that. Like
Okay.
this is how the data is incorrect, or that's not a reliable source of information. Do you have any other source of information?" Um, and sometimes people they respond negatively to that, and some people will say, okay, I don't agree with you, but I appreciate the fact that you're trying to be civil, that you're trying to engage, that you're asking questions. um, and so yeah, I mean, often I'll just when people make certain assertions, I'll either ask them to define their terms, just can you just explain to me what you mean by that, or I'll ask them to provide some kind of evidence, like do you have something that supports what you're saying. And also, could you
Okay.
tell me where you found it? Because I want to go read it myself. And in some cases, I'll go and I'll like if somebody says like read this, I will go read it. You
Yeah.
know, sometimes it's hard, and sometimes I'm like, oh my god. But then I come back and I say, well, I read this, and this is what I think about it. You know, but I think any opportunity to slow things down, to get people to have to do a little bit more work to support what they're saying, to think about what they're saying, um, is usually helpful. And if nothing else, it just slows the interaction down a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Because it could be that while the person's going to find that information, they calm down a little bit. Maybe they can catch a breath. Maybe they can drink a little water, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
It gives me a moment to relax, calm down, because maybe I'm getting upset, and it just slows the action down a little bit. But I think
Okay.
anything we can do to just get people to have to think a little bit harder is helpful.
Okay.
You know.
Cool. Then I do have one last question, and
Mm-hmm.
this is switching to a completely other topic. As I was doing some research, I noticed some comments about Black Lives Matter as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on criticisms of Black Lives Matter?
Well, again, in my experience, most criticisms of Black Lives Matter begin with some kind of misinformation or misunderstanding about it. Um, and it actually got to the point where I actually created a class about the movement because this was so common. And I would say, okay, again, like I said before, like this person's opinion just isn't informed. I mean, it's not that they're a bad person. It's just that most of their information is coming from, sources that aren't particularly good or very reliable. And so I'm like, well, we can do something about that, which is
Yeah.
to give people 14 weeks to really dig in and really learn more than just sound bites and, whatever they heard on the news and that kind of thing. So I would say a lot of the criticisms are just they're sort of inaccurate.
Okay.
They're either factually inaccurate or they're unfair. Like the judgments are unfair. And that includes from Black folk as well. I mean, there are Black people who say very critical things about the movement, and I'll say, well, that's just factually inaccurate what you're saying. It's just not accurate.
Okay.
And here's a chance to learn some more about it.
Yeah.
And so, I think, well, that's my immediate answer to that question. Obviously, depending on who you are, there are some valid critiques. I mean, first of all, this is another thing about asking people questions. When people talk about the movement, I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, who are you talking about? Are you talking about a particular organization? Are you talking about particular individuals? Are you talking about the mass movement? Let's just start there, because then we can figure out, well, what are we even talking about in the first place? So, for example, somebody will say something critical about an organization that is accurate, but then they'll generalize that to the whole movement. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Really, you're talking about this one group of people, you know? And so that generalization is inaccurate because when you look at other groups of people, they're doing it differently or they're doing it better or they didn't do what you just described. That's a perfect example, right?
Okay.
So I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. And there was one thing in particular with Black Lives Matter that was, well, two things actually.
Mm-hmm.
One common criticism, which also I also see some validity to it, is there we had the civil rights movement, right? And we had like these kind of concrete leaders, and it was more individuals who could create a lot of mass movements. There were organizations as well, but really individuals played a very big part in that. And it seems like it kind of changed a lot with Black Lives Matter. And I think the only word I can kind of find is became a bit watered down. I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
criticism that, once you can buy stickers for it, put it on your computer and that's enough, that's very different. So what do you think of that type of criticism and, the racism denial? Do you think that's a form of it or?
That's a really interesting question. I wouldn't say that that's a form of racism denial. I do think, and I talk about this in my classes, it's important for people to think about, how do they believe that change happens, which is itself is a helpful question, right?
Yeah.
And to say, okay, it sounds like your critique is coming from a particular idea about what change looks like, right? And you're saying that the movement doesn't sort of fit with that.
Yeah.
And so, what makes you think that that's the best way to change things? And then they can explain it, and they can talk about it. And then we can get into the ways that the movement, in some ways, the movement is doing some of the stuff that you're describing. It may be doing something differently, and here's why they're doing it differently.
Yeah.
But I think it's helpful to, again, often, that's okay. Again, I think often when people are talking about problems, um, there's a need to kind of take a step back and look at the big questions, right? And one question is like, well, how do you think change should happen in the first place? And what makes you think that, right?
Yeah.
Like, where did you get that idea, or what makes you think that this is the best way to do it? Sometimes the answers are really great. Sometimes the answers are kind of like, okay, that doesn't make sense to me,
Yeah.
or actually the historical evidence doesn't support what you're saying. Like, I feel you, but the available evidence doesn't really support that, right? So that's how I try to think about that. You know,
Okay.
it's just really taking a step back and just saying, okay, like, what are we talking about? And really, I think trying to surface people's underlying assumptions a little bit and bring them out into the open so we can look at them together, and then we can test their merits.
Okay. Thanks.
Uh,
That's a good answer.
I just have one last question. Yeah, and I'm sorry, but let you go. So I did mention earlier that you are the faculty lead at the Boston University Center for Antiracist Research. And I know, let's see, you were saying that one of the things you want to do is to build, and you work towards building an anti-racist society. So
Mhm.
yeah, I know I know the side of your work. I understand that. What other things does the organization do or that you do to build an anti-racist society?
Okay.
Well, 1 minute.
I would say, well, I'll talk about myself for the sake of time because the center does many, many, many things. I would say that the primary focus of my work at this point is helping to help to close the learning gap I was talking about before. It's really to make sure that adults are well prepared to be part of the solution, and that's a matter both of will and skill. right? It's not enough to be committed, dedicated, passionate person. There are real skill sets that you need to develop in order to solve this problem. And we can do that. We can help people to do that. And so I'm really focused on trying to identify, and this is what my scholarship really focuses on, what do people need to learn in order to solve this problem? And what are the best methods to help them to do that? So I'm really interested both in the science and the art of developing people's capacity to be part of the solution, as Malcolm said. And so that's really what my work focuses on now. That's what my research is about. That's what my teaching is about. That's what my service is about. Because at least to me, that's one thing that I can do to help to achieve a world without racism. Because we're never going to do that if people don't know how to do it. So we have to change that.
Right. Even if they have the will, they don't have the skill, then it's not going to happen.
You really do have to have both. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Copeland. Well, what a great, I said this would be one of our most uncommon conversations. I definitely think it fit that. So thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your time. Yes. And the work that you're doing too is amazing.
Yeah. So I look forward to when this drops and being able to hear what it was like and to share it with others.
Yep. And I'll definitely be in contact with you about that. And yes, again, asante. And yeah, see you soon. I have that a long time ago. So
Ashe. Yes.
Ashe.
Nice to meet you, Ben.
All right, you too. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. This concludes today's discussion about racism denial. Jumbo community, it's Amma Robin again. Wow, 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 wow. This was an interesting discussion with Dr. Copeland, wasn't it? I hope that you've learned a lot about racism denial and its effects, its damaging effects. Remember that racism denials are used as a political strategy and a coping mechanism. I can almost understand using it as a coping mechanism. I don't like it, but I can understand it a bit. Racism is scary and it's hurtful and it's complicated. No one wants to admit that racism is prevalent in almost every aspect of living Black in America and probably around the world. So denial can be a way of coping with this truth. But racism denial as a political strategy is reprehensible. It's inexcusable. Yet, it's one of the major strategies used to advance a person's popularity, their social or political acceptance, and their political power. We mentioned Tucker Carlson. But yes, Black people can do it too. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And what about Candace Owens? And I always come back to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who's pushing this quote-unquote anti-woke legislation and anti-woke mindsets, at the same time removing Black history from school curricula and from libraries. And he says that Black history doesn't have any educational value. And we know that's, I'm going to use the nice word, we know that's BS. And we know it's racism denial. Speaking of that, do you remember the 8 types of racism denials? Doesn't matter, I'm going to repeat them. 1, refuting. 2, minimizing. 3, myopia. 4, replacing. 5, defending. 6, excusing. 7, revising history. And 8, distorting. I'm also going to put them on the website and I'm going to put them on Instagram. So if you need some more explanation about those. And of course, you can always re-listen to the podcast. I have seen every single one of these and not just once. I've seen them a lot. What about you? Okay, and I got to ask you, have you said or used any of these racism denials yourself? I'm asking everyone, not just white people, Black folks too. As I said, I've used them without realizing it. And we just got to be honest with ourselves. That's how we grow. And remember, please, the responses that Dr. Copeland mentioned. My personal favorite was simply to ask, do you know what racism is? There are different ways that can be asked, and more nicely, more accusatory, but I think that simple sentence can really be effective. Do you know what racism is? That's going to stop a lot of people. Perhaps it'll make them think about what they're really saying. And hopefully they can start to consider what racism is and how they might be contributing to an environment of racism. I hope that this uncommon conversation empowered you in our anti-racism mission and in our self-care efforts. Yes, self-care. Being able to identify racism and racism denials is a way to understand racism, to learn about it, and it'll help you to minimize the stress responses to racism and racial encounters. Asante Sana, a big Asante Sana to Dr. Phillippe Copeland for generously contributing his time, his energy, and expertise to us and to you, and for the amazing work that he's doing. Asante Sana to you for showing up and staying with us. We appreciate you and your presence and your continued support. You really are the reason that we do what we do every single day. And you can join us every day to discuss these issues on Instagram at AmaRobinL. That's just the letter L. And you can check out my profile, leave your questions, comments, reflections, and just about anything you want to say. I want to hear from you, and I'm here for you too. If you think other people will be interested, and I hope you do, in this Black Empowerment podcast show, then please send it to them. We got to start talking about these issues, and we got to keep talking about them. I'm going to put a recent article about racism denials authored by Dr. Copeland on the Espresso Talk Today website in the Habari section. Habari means information in Swahili, and I'd put lots of new and important information on that page. I'm going to put it on Instagram too, so you look for that. This is really important. And if you want to keep discussing or just reading about these issues, then you should definitely subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Normal Beat. We discuss lots of different issues there. You can get your dose of Black empowerment there every single week. It's never a dull moment, but lots of growth moments. You can subscribe on the Espresso Talk Today website, espressotalktoday.com, or on Instagram at AmaRobinL. I'm Ama Robin for Espresso Talk Today. And remember, now more than ever, strength, soul, and reparations. Ashe.